Welcome to Connected. I'm your host, Haley Trimboli, and whether you are PhD curious, navigating your program, or wondering what your fellow graduates are up to, this podcast is your go-to for inspiring stories, actionable insights, and meaningful connections within the PhD community. All right. Hi, everyone. Today on Connected, we have an incredible guest who's using data to uncover the social forces shaping our cities and communities. Dr. Kfir Mordechay is an associate professor at Pepperdine University, where he teaches courses on leadership, public policy, and statistics. His research focuses on some of the most pressing issues in urban development: suburbanization, gentrification, and the causes and consequences of housing and school segregation. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR, bringing data-driven insights to the national conversation on social inequity and public policy. So welcome to the podcast, Kfir. Where does this podcast find you today?
Here in my nice little apartment in cozy Santa Monica in Southern California, and it is raining, so this is a special day. If you're from SoCal, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, we welcome the rain. So let's just start at the beginning. I would love to understand where your interest in actually pursuing a PhD began for you. Like if this was something that you had always wanted to do and was just naturally a part of your journey, or if it sort of came up through your academic journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me. First of all, this is great. It's giving me a chance to really reflect back on my own journey. As far as how I ended up doing a PhD, it was never really something that was in the works. It was not something that I thought about. My background is, a first generation college student. So even the idea of understanding what a PhD was just not my sort of, it was just not in the cards. But I was always curious. I always loved learning. And when I graduated college, my dream was really to become a teacher. So at that point, I just applied to a bunch of teacher education programs. I ended up, getting into UCLA and finding the sort of perfect program. It was a 2-year program in teacher education. The first year was just all taking classes about learning, about pedagogy. And then the second year of the program was meant to place you in a teaching job, like as a first year. So it was really just a dream come true getting into this program. But for any one of your guests that understands economic history or is old enough remembers that 2008, 2009, the global economy basically imploded. I don't know where you were, Haley, but I was in the middle of this program, and it turns out that UCLA could not guarantee the job for our cohort that they had guaranteed all other classes that came before us. So it was a very chaotic time. What that basically meant was that, teaching was off the table and I had to pivot, and I ended up basically, the program asked us, hey, look, you're not teaching the second year, propose project for what you're going to do in your second year in graduate school. So I ended up taking classes with, a bunch of different faculty at UCLA, and I ended up taking a class with this guy who is a legend in the field. His name is Gary Orfield. He ended up being my academic advisor, but that kind of opened the door to a PhD where I ended up working under his supervision. So it was very circuitous and unplanned. Really, it was just a matter of like a door closing and another one sort of opening almost on accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I have to ask, because I was looking at your background, do you have 2 bachelor degrees as well? Like one international, one in the US?
Yeah,
Okay.
no. Well, I was studying in the Netherlands. I was in the Netherlands for a year. Over there, I studied economics. So I basically have 2 bachelor degrees, one in economics and one in international affairs.
Okay, I see. I see. And you were wanting to get into like K through 12 education
Yeah.
was the
Yeah, I
original.
always loved history. I thought,
Okay.
I was always very worldly. I traveled a lot. I wasn't born in the US. I was actually born in Israel. My family lived in Africa for like the first 9 years of my life. So we lived in Nigeria. So I was always sort of very international and I had very international interests. So I wanted to teach US and world history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought the idea of having summers off was also appealing and, just working with young minds.
Yes, yes. Well, I know that journey as a former K through 12
Mm,
educator that summers off are nice. UCLA master's program, change of plans. Like, so
yes.
tell me about like, did you have to go through like a formal application? UCLA is a top tier school. Like, what? I don't know. Like, some listeners might be in that phase. Like, what did that sort
Yeah.
of application, getting into the program, a PhD program at UCLA, nonetheless, like, look like?
Yeah, I mean, they call this like the hidden curriculum. Some people kind of know what to do and what levers to pull, and others don't. And I was, I guess, one of those that did not really know what is the formal process of getting in, how do you do it. But luckily, one of the skills that I still try to maintain till this day that I've always kind of had is I'm not scared to ask for help, right? Like I always felt like I had gaps in my knowledge, gaps in terms of understanding how systems work, but I always was open with other people and I would always be like I was always willing to take advice. If I was told, hey, you want to apply to a PhD, it really is all about this relationship that you will potentially have with your mentor. So the most important thing is to reach out to these people whose research you are interested in, understand what it is that they're doing, and have conversations with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically ended up doing this with a couple of people that I had identified who I was hoping to work with. And you learn all sorts of things just along the process. So just to give you an example, one of the guys I wanted to work with at Berkeley, I ended up having a conversation with him. He's like, "Oh, this is great. Like, I think you're awesome, but I'm not picking any students next year. So, unfortunately, like this is just not in the cards." So
Mm-hmm.
that's very useful information to do. That means I can kind of,
Yeah.
utilize that Berkeley ammunition in another department or another faculty member.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up doing this. And, what was interesting just about this whole process is the person who I ended up working with at UCLA, I was his last student. So he's much older. He was in his 70s at the time. And all of these other faculty members across the country that I had identified who I wanted to work with, they were all kind of traced back to his lineage.
Interesting.
So yeah, all fingers were just kind of pointing back at Gary, who again I ended up working with at UCLA.
Interesting. It was like it was meant to be, brought you back to
Hmm.
him. So that's really cool. I mean, the
Yeah.
source of it all, right? So working with Gary, like, did you have like, because that was a bit, so still, I'm just fascinated about the switch from like a teacher to a PhD student. Like,
Yeah.
did you have a topic in mind? Because I feel like schools are very different. Like some schools, you might not have that topic in mind, but if you are going to work under somebody, a
Yeah.
research institution, like, were you aligned then with that, like his
Mm.
area? Obviously, you were doing that research. Like, was that already like you were ready to go in that direction, or was there still some room to develop that as you began the program?
That's a question. So I think my experience was not at all typical, and Gary is a non-typical person. He was kind of in the tail end of his career, and he was this like polymath. He was a professor of urban planning, of urban studies, education, political science, and law all at once. And he ran this big institute at UCLA. So I came in with these very broad research interests, and he was also sort of a broad person. So I think he felt comfortable taking me on even when I wasn't like super honed in or super refined in terms of what I wanted to study. But definitely other cohort mates, other people that came with me were very specific in terms of, the projects they wanted to work on, what they wanted to study, and how that aligned with their mentor.
Okay. Yeah. So there it sounds like there's some flexibility and that one worked out for you because all
Hmm.
the different topics and such were your areas of interest anyways.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So you get into the program. Like, what did a typical day in the life look like in the program? Was there a typical day in the life?
Yeah. Well, a typical day, well, you have a full load of classes. These classes are during the day. You come in with a small group of students who become your cohort mates. I think my cohort was maybe 7 students or 8 students. So I'm literally taking classes with the same groups of people. And, you start with like the introductory classes, the introduction to research methods, and then some of like the core courses. And then you're just really, trying to figure out this new world that you just entered. You're signing up for this really long process.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Mm-hmm.
I also, part of, kind of a traditional PhD is there's like a funding package, but the funding has strings attached to it. And in my case, I was told, okay, well, here's your funding, but it's contingent on you working on X project for, 10 hours a week. So
Mm-hmm.
this kind of becomes a parallel job working on a project while you're taking classes,
Mm-hmm.
you know, with your cohort mates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then did you have teaching responsibilities as well throughout your time?
Eventually, I went that direction, but that took a couple of years. These are like very competitive positions, right? If you want like to teach a class. So one of the first class I taught was actually Gary's class. It was the last class that he taught. It was like an education policy and law. He had taught that with his wife. So I TA'd that class with him. That was a whole lot of fun. I'll never forget one of the days in that class. UCLA had just beaten USC in football. I think it was like, it was like the first time in maybe a decade that had been. And in the middle of the class, as Gary and Patricia are teaching, this guy walks in and everyone just gets up. Like 300 people start clapping for him. And Gary is like starstruck. He's like, what is happening? And then someone pointed to Brett Hundley and was like, he was the guy that beat USC over the weekend. And
Nice.
then Gary looks over the class, he's like, and looks over at Brett, and he's like, you've done more for UCLA than 99% of the faculty here. So, yeah, standing ovation is warranted here.
That's hilarious. Yeah. He's
Yeah,
like royalty there at that moment for you guys.
royalty at that moment,
Yeah.
exactly. And Gary
Yeah.
recognized it, right? So
Yeah.
I had a pretty cool advisor.
Yeah. That sounds like it. Exactly. Kind of like the practicality of like what's important right now. You've
Yes.
got to acknowledge that.
I mean, we all benefit when, when our team wins the football games.
Absolutely. Absolutely. School pride, all that thing. So cool. So, like, what were some of the challenges of the program for you? Whether it was like, I mean, was it the writing? Was it research? Was
Yeah.
it just learning, time management? What would you say challenges of the program were?
Yeah, I would say pretty much all of the above. My writing was not where it should have been. Obviously, you need to write to do research. You need to write to communicate your research to get funding. It all kind of, it's like a very foundational skill. So I would say one of the big turning points for me was when I discovered the Writing Center. And I
Mm,
often encourage my students at Pepperdine to utilize the Writing Center, and it's shocking how little do. But when I
yeah.
tell them, like, it changed, literally changed my trajectory, I'm being serious. So I went
Mm,
to the Writing Center a lot,
hmm.
and I actually met someone there who became a very close friend of mine.
Mm,
Shout out to Amanda. Amanda was one of the consultants there, and she
hmm.
was just so incredible. I
Hmm.
mean, helping me edit and helping me improve my writing, to secure funding,
Hmm.
articles I was trying to write for publication. And
Hmm.
we actually ended up becoming close friends. And I even basically ended up inviting her to my wedding like a couple of years
Amazing.
later. Like that's how close we got. I mean, she was such a lifesaver.
Hmm.
Later on, she helped me, fix my CV and my resume. She just became a big part of my
Mm-hmm.
journey. And I know not everyone needed that in my cohort,
Yeah.
but I definitely did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's such a huge resource. I appreciated that at Pepperdine. I definitely tapped into that. I mean, it's part of your
Yes.
resource pool there that you have. And sometimes it's like not utilized, I think, as much as like what they're willing to. And I've always found that they're so like willing to help you and meet you where you
Yeah.
are. And like if you're not feeling like you're great in the writing realm, they definitely meet you where you are and help you.
Yeah, yeah, and also it's one of those things, right? With all of the resources that are available at a place like Pepperdine, and especially at a place like UCLA, where it's a behemoth, right? It's very different
Hmm.
than GSEP. Like you can totally get lost in the behemoth and not really
Yeah.
know what's available to you until someone points you to the right place. So
Yeah.
it's really important to keep an eye out for what's available.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you are a like, would you identify yourself as a quantitative researcher mainly?
Yes, yes, I'm
Okay.
definitely
Yeah.
a quantitative researcher.
Okay. So tell me about that journey. Like, did you do quantitative research in your undergrad or your master's, or was this something very new in your program?
So I guess I was always kind of quantitatively inclined. I always kind of had fun with numbers and fun with arithmetic. And when I got accepted into UCLA, my funding again was contingent on me doing work for Gary and his lab and his research team. And I basically became the quantitative person or one of the quantitative people there. So whenever they needed like data analyzed, I was kind of the go-to. I had to like really familiarize myself with the surveys. And Gary was also, he's a policy person, so he was much more quantitative as well. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it happens in Pepperdine as well. But when you get into these programs, oftentimes there's like a huge wedge between the qualitative folks and the quantitative folks. Hopefully now
Mm-hmm.
the polarization has eased a little bit, but that has been how things have unfolded traditionally in grad programs.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like, so writing center was helpful for writing, and
Yes.
you're doing the like, what are there any resources that you leaned into for research, like to help in that area, other than just like working with your mentor,
Yes.
other students, etc.
Yes. 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 So again, I think the kind of master skill here, and I'm so lucky that I have this skill, and or if you want to call it a skill, but I am so okay asking someone for help
Yeah.
when I can't figure it out. So another thing I discovered at UCLA, which really helped me out, especially with like my first publication, was the Statistics Consulting Center.
Okay.
Because even, like I spent time working with data, right? And I was familiar with data, but these people were just like next level
Mm-hmm.
statisticians. And this is just, yeah, you got to go and you got to wait for an hour to see them, right? In their office hours, but they are there and they are a free resource. And they were, again, just so incredibly helpful, right? I would
Mm-hmm.
just like, tell them, hey, here's my problem. This is how I'm thinking of like answering it. And they would like help me build the model, help me fix, my data if like the output wasn't running. So
Mm-hmm.
that was like a very useful resource. Another one was a person who I met who was another graduate student in another department. I mean, he was just like a whiz when it came to statistics, and he also helped me. He helped refine like my programming skills, right? How to run output. And he
Nice.
would sit with me for hours over a
Mm-hmm.
weekend and say, hey, look, like this is how we're going to do this. And I
Mm-hmm.
learned a lot from him as well.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That is key
And
for
find the right
sure.
people. Find the right
Mm-hmm.
people. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I personally love assisting people when I
Yeah.
can. Like I feel good when I do it. And
Mhm.
I have found that people really do like to be of service if they feel like they're helping you grow.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I never leaned into like a research center, but I mean, it's the same thing with like the writing center that I felt like
Hmm.
we were talking about is like they are more than happy to help you and meet you where you are. So great. So I'd love to start to move toward like your dissertation topic. So your
Okay.
dissertation title was From Boom to Bust: The Effects of the Great Recession on Neighborhoods and Schools. So tell me
Hmm.
like what led you to your dissertation topic and this dissertation, and then sort of like what were some of your key findings or insights that you gained from.
Yeah, no, I mentioned the recession, the Great Recession earlier. So this was this like pivotal shock in my life, like it was in many people's lives. I was student teaching at the time and I saw like the havoc it wreaked at the schools. A lot of students, left school in the middle of the year because like their families needed like a second income. It was just a very chaotic time. And then when I was at UCLA, I also spent some time doing a report for the Civil Rights Project, which was the think tank I was working with at UCLA, on the impacts of the recession on Southern California. So I was always kind of thinking about the recession. And it was something that I always kind of had in my back pocket, even though I was unsure what I was going to do my dissertation on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I landed there specifically when I actually, again, I sought out someone who I really respected, who
Mm-hmm.
was this economist he still is at Berkeley. His name is David Card. He actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics like a couple years ago, but this was before
Amazing.
then. Yeah, so I basically go into his office hours and I had 15 minutes with him and I was like, hey, look, I have three dissertation topics, and I'm wondering which one you think is better, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I laid
Mm-hmm.
out the three, and one of the three was the recession as like an exogenous shock and how it impacts different groups of people. And he's like, "Oh, I like that one." And
Mm-hmm.
here's one way you can look at that. And I didn't, fully take his advice on like the design, but he
Mm-hmm.
liked the general idea of it. So I just had to make a decision, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the decision that I made. I went with that topic. And
Mm-hmm.
basically, the first step for that paper is I had to get access to like a lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. I reached out to like a bunch of school districts. I wanted like internal administrative data. So I ended up getting one that was on board, although they were like super frustrated with me towards the end because it was like a very involved process. I got all this data and yeah, I basically told a couple of stories. And one of the stories was that in the global financial crisis, school mobility, meaning students transferring in and out of schools, was more likely to happen for middle class students than it was for poor students.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of counterintuitive because most of the research on school mobility is focused on low income students because their housing situation is very precarious.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it was middle class students because this was a housing crisis and the
Mm-hmm.
foreclosures tended to affect owner occupied households.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at their probabilities of graduating, their GPAs,
Mm-hmm.
their school mobility probabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there were some really interesting findings there. The other finding, which was notable, and this became, I think, either my first or my second publication, is that graduation rates actually increased in the middle of the economic shock.
Huh.
And this was also kind of counterintuitive because you would think a shock creates all these stress mechanisms where
Mm-hmm.
students are less likely to graduate from high school. But it ended up being the case that because the job market was so bad, students that might be inclined to drop out ended up staying in school because there were
Mm-hmm.
no jobs out there for
Mm-hmm.
them. So that
Mm-hmm.
actually counterintuitively raised the graduation rates. So I would say
Mm-hmm.
those are like two of my bigger findings from my
Mm-hmm.
dissertation.
Yeah, so interesting. And the way that you articulate it too is like understanding the why or what might have been going on is very interesting there.
I
So after you found that, like what did you do? Did you keep obviously you said you kept looking into
Yeah.
something, what did that look like after you published this dissertation and found your results?
Yeah. Well, at that point, I was incredibly tired and kind of burnt out from the
Really?
process, right? As I'm sure you know. Exactly. So I didn't really have a lot of interest in publishing the results in a journal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then again, one of the people that I met in grad school was like, "Hey, like, why don't you just try to like take a small piece of it and try to publish it?" And she was like, "I can actually like help you. Like, I
Nice.
can look at it, I can edit it for you. Just
Mm-hmm.
send it to me."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Okay, I should at least put some of this work out there."
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up doing it, and
Mm.
my first paper, like, I think I got lucky that it got published. When I kind of look back at it, I was like, okay, I must have had some friendly reviewers there. But that gave me the confidence I needed to kind of sustain myself and be re-inspired.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then I did it with another piece of my dissertation, and that was like
Mm.
a publication till this day that I'm proud of. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I put it out there. Now it's for
Yeah.
people to cite if they
Great.
would like.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's great to know. Like you took in two parts of it, or you published two separate parts of it too. Like
Hmm.
I think that's always kind of the big question. Like, how
Yeah,
do
it was
you do
actually
you take this whole
3,
thing?
but it
Three.
was
Okay,
actually
three.
3.
Fantastic. Awesome. Great. Cool. Yeah.
Uh,
So then you're a little burnt out, but the
yeah,
PhD program's over, you're in academia now. Like
right.
what happened after you graduated, and how did you end up to where you are now?
Yeah, so it was a very stressful time. I was open to being an academic.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, my advisor was really trying to push that. But, we all kind of understand the statistics around like academic jobs and tenure track jobs. There's just like, high supply, low demand. It's like the worst
Mm.
type of relationship.
Yeah.
So I decided that I was going to give the academic job market like put in like real effort to see just what happens. And if it doesn't work out, I'll kind of pivot and do something else.
Mm-hmm.
So my first year after I graduated, I ended up applying for several jobs. I had, one interview where I became a finalist in, and, it was not Pepperdine. It was at another university.
Mm-hmm.
And, I basically end up sort of messing that up. I was just a
Mm.
little too fresh and unpolished as
Okay.
far as like being around a committee for 24 hours and needing to say all the
Mm.
right things.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So that didn't work out. And I ended up basically doing a postdoc back at UCLA, and then kind
Okay.
of dipping my feet into like, some consultancy work,
Mm-hmm.
some like technical assistance, education work, and
Mm-hmm.
until, Pepperdine came through a couple months later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you landed at Pepperdine, and what did you start with?
Yeah.
Like what did you what was your what were you doing?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I got very lucky with Pepperdine. I actually, Dr. Ebony Kane,
Mm-hmm.
she actually had graduated from my cohort. So she was already at
Mm-hmm.
Pepperdine, and
Mm-hmm.
like a good networker, I was networking and seeing what opportunities are available. And I met with Ebony, and we met for coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Hey, I know that Pepperdine might be looking for someone, that has maybe your skill set, is a bit like eclectic, does global things, is quantitative." And I'm very eclectic with my research interest. And that is, that is not something I'm bragging about. That's actually like a detriment in typical academic context, but it ended up
Okay.
being a positive at Pepperdine.
Uh-huh.
And so I met with Farzine, and honestly, we just hit it off.
Nice.
And he was like, "Yeah, you sound great, and let's
Mm-hmm.
stay connected." And then he reached back
Mm-hmm.
out to me, brought me in for an interview, and
Okay.
I ended up at Pepperdine, and it's been
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you balance like all your responsibilities at Pepperdine, teaching, like you're still doing a lot of research, like mentoring students, being on
Yeah.
dissertations, like how do you balance all that?
Yeah, it's not easy, but one thing that I think is unique about Pepperdine is that we have many faculty with diverse interests and diverse skill sets. And some of us focus more on research and others focus more on like program development and, some of, administrative duties. And I think we all kind of understand that we all kind of need each other for this thing to work.
Mm-hmm.
So luckily I'm able to focus on the things that I enjoy doing most, which is
Okay.
kind of the academic research, and
Yeah.
teaching is just something that really invigorates me. And yeah, it can get challenging sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
but it's always just this like seesaw struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What does it take to be like a good teacher and a good researcher? Like what skills do you
Yeah.
need to like do all they seem like very different worlds. Like
Yeah.
what do you need to be good at it?
Yeah, I don't know what you need to be good at both simultaneously. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
very difficult because, like
Mm-hmm.
you said, you're just exercising two very different parts of the mind. But I would say, as far as teaching, and, obviously this is like a very subjective take, but I've also found this with teachers I've enjoyed. I think someone that is truly passionate about what they do and what they're talking about. To me, that's contagious, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't need someone to have every answer, but I do want someone engaged and passionate
Mm-hmm.
and curious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, at least for me personally, all of the content that I cover in my classes are things that I spend so much of my waking life actually thinking about, right?
Yeah.
This is not something like, oh yeah, I'm teaching tomorrow. Okay, how am I going to deliver this? Like, I am
Mm.
thinking about policy. I'm thinking about, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East. I'm thinking about, the election. Like, this is like my bedtime
Yeah.
reading, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm hoping, I hope that that helps. I think that that should help. And then, research, I think it's patience is really important because it's a slow moving process. I think
Mm-hmm.
knowledge is not cheap. And there's an illusion that it is cheap, especially given our like information ecosystem and how we kind of cycle through, through like global events, right? Like when you
Mm-hmm.
read content online, it's just cheap, but research is like the exact opposite of that, right? It's like it's
Mm-hmm.
careful, it's meticulous, it takes a long time. So I think
Mm-hmm.
if you have that skill set and you meet the right people and have the right collaborations,
Mm-hmm.
you can really do some powerful work.
Yeah, yeah. And how are you meeting those people? Like, how do you find people that you want to research with? Like, you're not scared to reach out. So I'm sure that's probably that. But like, what other ways have you met people to do research with?
Yeah, yeah. So I've been, I would kind of think about this in terms of like different phases in my life. I think when I was more of a student, it was like latching on to the people that were closest to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of my cohort mates who was working with Gary's wife at the time, we ended up just kind of being a natural fit, and we really worked together well for a while, and we kind of stuck together, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think you had some of that in our class
Yep.
with, you were working with, I think it was like Leanne, was it with
Mm-hmm.
Leanne and
Yeah.
Brian? Was it Brian? No, what's his
Blair.
Blair, right. Yeah, you guys were like the superstar team. I was always looking to my side. So very similar to that. I think as like my academic identity matured and as I graduated, I think really being strategic at research conferences and
Mm-hmm.
where I'm going to present and the people I was having conversations with at these research conferences.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what sustained me after my PhD. And
Mm-hmm.
lately, it's been a bit more bold. I'm kind of going back to my roots of what you were hinting at, which is like really reaching out to random people. which
Yeah.
is kind of what I did during my sabbatical. I just said, you know what, I'm
Nice.
reaching out to a person every other week, like in a different
Nice.
field, in a different part of the world, and I'm having a conversation.
Cool.
And that's what I ended up doing. And yeah, it's worked out because I have
Mm-hmm.
some really interesting collaborations like happening right now because of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool.
Yeah,
And your research has also been featured in like major media outlets. So, like, how did
right.
that happen? And what advice do you have for PhDs who want to reach a broader audience outside of just like the academia, peer reviewed sort of journals or conferences and stuff?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think, well, at least my strategy has always been, right, there's like the publishing, the research, and then it's like what happens with it at that point. How do you disseminate it to different audiences, to the wider public? So my strategy has been once I have something that I am proud of, something that I think people will be interested in, it's my job to try to communicate this to like non-academic audiences. And some of the ways I found most effective is like pitching this to local newspapers, to bigger newspapers, honestly, like reaching out to journalists myself and saying, hey, look, here's like a study I just published. Like, if you're interested in this, you have to deal with a lot of rejection when you do these things.
Mm-hmm.
But once in a while, something does hit and it can be powerful. And you also start developing relationships with folks in different spaces when you start doing this more and more.
Yeah, yeah. So rejection is like a key component of the PhD
Yeah.
process, I feel like, from start to finish. Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. How do I deal with that? It's God, I feel like I don't want to give you like the traumatized response, but I've become quite good at like letting go
Yeah.
of rejection. I mean, I think just understanding that there's a lot of randomness involved in life in general, and you just don't really know who's on the other side of it. Like I've had some really, really demoralizing rejections where I've
Mm.
like submitted something and it's been sitting for under review for 6 months, and then I edit it
Oh.
for 3 months and I get a revision and I send it back and then I get rejected after like a year and a
Mm.
half.
Yeah.
That's a very tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
But I think having a bit of faith and understanding that, you can't really control everything and your job is to just kind of like move on to the next thing, right? It's sort
Mm-hmm.
of like everything is like contingent on something else and you can't really understand the big picture, right? And just
Mm-hmm.
reminding myself that, I might think I know what I'm looking at, but I don't always know what I'm looking at.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I think like you're a very accomplished scholar. And so knowing that, this happens to everybody and it's
Oh,
part of the
yeah.
process and ways to kind of just work through it or think through it, I think that's helpful.
Yeah, and you never really know what actually sticks. That's the other thing I've learned. Actually, if I look at the work that I've done, and this is almost, I mean, it's kind of comical how inverse this relationship is, but the work I am actually most proud of is the least visible
Mm.
of any of my pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of ironic, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
work that was very carefully done. This was the
Mm.
work that I literally spent so much time refining. And,
Mm.
it doesn't really get any visibility. It's some of my other work, which I kind of thought was, a bit more basic, not, to me wasn't like big
Mm.
works. So you
Mm-hmm.
just got to
Yeah.
put it out to the world and see what
Yeah.
comes back your way.
Yeah, and you can't predict it. You can't like
Can't
assume
predict it.
because it is your special piece or the one that you did your best work on that's what's gonna stick out there.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you had a sabbatical and you were reaching out to people every other week or every week.
Yeah.
Like what are you working on now? Like anything that you can share, any new like research projects, like the big ideas that you're excited about?
Yeah, well, so I last year I worked on a project that was funded by the Spencer Foundation. It was very big. It's a very prestigious funder, so it got like a lot of attention from Pepperdine and elsewhere as well. And this piece was really looking at gentrification dynamics within central cities and really asking the question of, is gentrification in some contexts more likely to result in schools becoming more diverse compared to other contexts? So I really looked at like all of California and different types of gentrifying neighborhoods in the urban core of like California cities. And that paper, that one has actually been under review for like the last 6 months. It's a bit frustrating. So hopefully that comes through. But I came across this guy, this scholar who does similar work, but he's not an education person. He's not really interested in educational processes. I ended up reaching out to him, and we had a really fruitful conversation. This was a couple weeks ago. And basically what he is thinking about is exactly what I've been thinking about for the last couple of months, which is, how is the urban gentrification process shaping the demographic dynamics in suburban areas? So as gentrification expands from the urban core into the suburbs, is that creating divergent or convergent trajectories to what we see happening in the urban areas? So I met this guy, and we're still in the process of like putting together some data. He's really great. Yeah, hopefully something good comes out of that. But that is kind of the next frontier. And another thing I'm working on is kind of looking at like land use regulations, zoning, like at the metropolitan level, like zoning for single family homes, just housing permits in general, and how that shapes these neighborhood and kind of school demographic composition shifts.
And you're like exploring literature in that space right now, like data, like where are you in at?
Yeah, well, right now, honestly, we're trying to just piece together this data set at the moment. And
Okay.
we have like a hypothesis, and hopefully actually have a meeting with him at 4 o'clock, and we'll see if if my hypothesis, if the data conforms to it. If it does, then, next time I talk to you, whenever that is, I'll be like full on writing mode.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be awesome. Well, I hope that for you. So, okay, two final questions
Yeah.
that I'm asking each guest. So, the first one being, what's one book, podcast, or article that you think every PhD student should read or listen to?
Great question. Of course, there are many, but if I had to pick one, and this is, I would say, the person that is, really just curious about how to become a better person, but also become a more rational person. And that is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Absolutely incredible book.
Okay,
Changed my
read it
life
or
in
listen
many
to it.
ways.
Okay,
Yes, it's
okay,
a great read. It's a great
yeah,
read. And
okay.
actually, fun fact, his research paper
Mm-hmm.
that that book is based off of is the most cited social science research paper of all time. Called,
Fascinating.
Decision Making Under Uncertainty. Yeah,
Okay,
Kahneman University. So
yeah,
great
yeah.
person.
So academic, but also I think that's like a very mainstream book as well.
Yeah, the book is the bestseller. So
Yeah.
it's bedtime reading.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. And then if you could give your younger self one piece of advice before starting your PhD, what would it be?
I would say be bold, network fearlessly, meet people not just in your orbit, but across
Mm,
disciplines and the
mm-hmm,
rest of the orbit.
mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to take intellectual risks. And just remember that this is as much a personal growth journey as it is an intellectual and academic.
Yeah, I love that. So, so good. Wonderful. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing all of your insights of your
Of
PhD
course.
journey, the real world impact that you're having, the work that you're doing now. I know listeners will take a lot from this. Before we wrap up, where's the best place for people to like follow your work, stay connected with what you're doing?
Site where you can follow my academic works, my works of the past and my present work. That's kfirmordechay.com. And probably the best way to stay connected with like recent developments is LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, I will link to both of those in the show notes. So thank you
Awesome.
again. Really appreciate your time.
Have a good one.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
What a great conversation with Dr. Mordechay, especially fun for me as a former student of his at Pepperdine. And I really appreciate that he's not just in the classroom doing research, but he's making his research more broadly available to the public through various mediums and platforms. And I will say that his passion for his topics really is so authentic, and I appreciate that. He always brought that into the classroom, and I can tell the research and the teaching that he does, as he mentioned, that these are the things that he is thinking about at night before he goes to bed. So it's not that he's necessarily having to put on a different persona or be somebody else, but these threads really do seem to trail throughout the different areas of his life. So what resonated with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop me a message or a comment. And thank you for tuning in to Connected. You can find all the links in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone in your PhD community. And be sure to follow along on LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube for more conversations like this. See you next time, and stay connected.